Kia ora, no mai haere mai ki te Vote 2023. My name is Charlotte Werner and this is Holly Thomas, and today joining us is Ethan Reille, the Labour candidate for the Waitaki electorate. Despite only being 19, Ethan comes with a wealth of experience due to his role as head boy of Waitaki Boys High School, a Waitaki District Youth Council chairperson and Youth MP for Rachel Brooking. Welcome, Ethan.
Kia ora, thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Now, Ethan, can you describe yourself as a Labour candidate in 3 adjectives?
I can describe myself as empathetic, progressive and bold.
Love these.
Yeah, fantastic adjectives to describe yourself. So we just wanted to know, how did you originally get into politics, and more specifically, what made you decide to join the Labour Party?
Yeah, good question. I think as a young person it's quite daunting getting involved in politics, especially the current election year and election cycle that we're in right now. I got involved in politics at the age of 15. It was the 2020 election. But for me, during 2020, whilst we felt really united as a country, the world around us was really fragile. So it was difficult to sort of navigate my way through how I could support our community and our response to the COVID-19 pandemic. But for me, it was also about ensuring that we had what we need to be able to get by. And so with that, I asked to volunteer for the Labour Party back in the 2020 election. I started out delivering pamphlets, knocking on doors, but I also started volunteering with our Pacific Island community group, and with them we helped offer testing stations and vaccination clinics, but we also did different food bank drives to ensure that our most vulnerable had what they needed to get by. So for me, it's always just been about the community for me, and making sure that I am representative of the community, but making sure that everyone has their voice and ensuring that we are stepping up for our most vulnerable in society and throughout our own communities.
Yeah, absolutely. We ran into your old friend Rachel Brooking actually, and we just wanted to show you what she had to say about yourself.
Hi, I'm here with Rachel Brooking, and we're just here to talk to you and ask you about your thoughts on Ethan, who is currently running for the Labour Party.
Yeah, so he was a youth MP, and I first met him when he was about 15, and he was campaigning with Liam Wairipo, who was standing in the Waitaki electorate. And he was just this very lovely, slightly gangly 15-year-old, so enthusiastic.
One question for you. If you could describe Ethan in 3 words, what 3 words would you choose?
Articulate, lovely, and smart.
There you go, that's pretty high praise, I would say, from Rachel.
Before.
I know, high praise indeed. We were wondering, has the Labour Party, like Rachel and the other Labour Party MPs, have they done much work to advocate for you, given that you are a particularly young candidate?
Yeah, definitely, especially Rachel. She won't like me saying this, but I refer to her as my political mum, so she's been a huge support. And that not only started out with being her youth MP, but when I decided to put my name forward for this candidacy, she was the first person I called, and her initial response was, "Oh, you're crazy, what are you doing?" But then she said, "No, you've absolutely got this, and just let me know what you need to be supported." Being from such a rural and large electorate, we're the 2nd largest general electorate in the country, it is hard to get around to different places, but I've had a lot of support through people like Rachel Brooking, but also people like Grant Robertson, as well as Jan Tinetti, and they've been really supportive in this campaign. But at the end of the day, it's the community which really provides that wraparound support. You know, this campaign isn't just about me, it's about our entire community, and so I want to ensure that everyone has a voice in that and that they're part of that effort as well.
Yeah. On the 9th of September, the ODT reported that you had the impossible task of storming a traditional blue bastion. How do you plan on turning the electorate red?
The advice Ingrid Leary has always given me, who I know she was on the show as well, is every single seat is winnable. The Waitaki electorate hasn't always been blue. It's been red many, many times. The last person was the Honourable David Parker. So for me, it's about actually putting an advocacy foot forward. Right now in our community, people are really asking, you know, over the past 18 years, we've had the same representation, but we also need to be asking ourselves who has been advocating for us. So for me, it's about being really bold in our stance that, you know, our bottom line is we want to ensure that places like Waitaki have equitable access to healthcare. We want to ensure that our children have what they need to thrive, but we also want to ensure that we've got community-led housing solutions, and those are the 3 big priority areas for our electorate. So for me, you know, taking the party politics aside, which I know is incredibly daunting at the moment, it's about who's going to be best to represent us. And I absolutely think that we're running a really positive campaign and people are really seeing that. But we take nothing for granted, and it's going to be a tough job, but we're giving it our absolute all.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you are elected, obviously you run a very positive message, and that's lovely to see. How do you think that your experience that you've had over the past 4 years will translate, and you can become an advocate for the community? How do you think that'll translate over into your politics?
Yeah, it comes down to be that grassroots advocate. I think at the moment people are really calling for community politicians, people that are going to really fight for what they need in their community, and I'm absolutely committed to that. I moved down to my community in 2018 to start high school, and since then I've really been trying to entrench myself in the community. But again, it goes back to the fact that we need the community to be calling for what they want to see. We need people like myself, people in these really privileged positions, to be listening to that and to be acting on that. We need community champions. And so for me, through experiences like being Rachel's youth MP, like being the youngest bureaucrat in New Zealand's history, all of those really add up, but I couldn't be able to do that without the support of our community. And so I really appreciate the people that have helped me to be able to fill these roles, but I want to ensure that we are representing the community and ensuring that they have what they need, and I'll absolutely fight for what they need in Parliament if successful.
Yeah, great. You are in a really interesting position, obviously, given your age and given the political issues that are surrounding us. You're in this really unique position where you're able to inspire a lot of change. So we'll address the elephant in the room, your age. You're 19, which is so impressive to be doing what you're doing, but at this current point in time, you've only voted in the local elections before. In the first national election you're able to vote in, you're running in. Yeah. So we know you get this question a lot, but do you believe your age is an advantage or a disadvantage to your politics?
I appreciate the question, and I appreciate people asking that. I don't think people should shy away from that. And the point I'll make is it's not normal for 19-year-olds to run for Parliament, but I'd like to see that normalised. And I think with time, you know, people will prevent themselves from saying, oh, there's that 18 or 19-year-old candidate. Instead, they'll say, oh, that's Ethan, you know, or that's Holly, you know. And so for me, it's about doing what I can to be able to continue paving that pathway for that next young person in Waitaki that decides to stand. And I absolutely believe that there will be another one, and they can absolutely do that. But right now we need to ask ourselves, is our Parliament truly representative of the wider population? We've got one of the most diverse parliaments in New Zealand's history, and we can't be complacent around that. We need to ensure that we're working towards protecting that. But we also need to ensure that all young people are represented. And you know, when you look at those under the age of 25, they make up 33% of our population, yet we are 100% of the future. So we need to ensure that if young people want to engage with our political systems, then they are represented. You know, if we want young people to be voting and be part of our democratic systems, we need to ensure that young people like yourselves and I are standing up for those roles, and they're absolutely able to do that, but we need to ensure that young people are able to support them in that role as well. It can be daunting for young people, both being in politics or even watching from afar. So the message is, you know, please get involved, please have your say, whether it's voting, whether it's volunteering. We can't be complacent in this upcoming election because so much is at stake for us as young people.
Mm-hmm. And there's often a narrative about young people in politics and that potentially they don't have enough real life experience. What would you respond to critics who are quite negative about the idea of young people in politics?
I think you really need to ask yourselves, how do you define life experience? Is it how many jobs you've had? Is it how many relationships you've been in? Is it, you know, how long that you've lived for? Right now we need a fresh perspective in Parliament, and we've got some incredible politicians and members of Parliament. But we also need to ensure that we're passing the baton down to younger generations, and that's one of the reasons why I am standing, because I want to ensure young people are heard in Parliament, are advocated in Parliament. You know, you talk about 33% of our population, they need to be heard. And so I respond to critics by saying, just listen to what we have to say, just be that support person, because we absolutely are able to represent our communities. That doesn't come down to age, that comes down to your community involvement and how passionate you are to represent that community and fight for the change that we so desperately need right now.
Yeah, so the Waitaki electorate has a median age of 45 years old, which is the third highest amongst our general electorates throughout the country. And obviously Holly just pointed out that you have received some negativity surrounding your age. And given the fact that you are in a very high age electorate, how do you plan on appealing to an older age group? And how do you plan to get them to pass the baton down to you?
Exactly, and look, I sympathise with people that are a little bit apprehensive about the age. You know, I probably would be too, but it comes down to be willing to have those conversations, and that's something that we've been really trying to drive in this campaign is, whilst my age may be a barrier for some voters, it's having those conversations and understanding actually we have a common narrative between us. We both want the best for our community, so how can we get that? But at the same time, I've had it all the comments, you know, the classic, who changes his nappies or has his mum let him out past 10 o'clock at night. And you can't take those comments seriously or personally. You just have to be able to fight through that. And at the end of the day, it comes down to being part of something that's much bigger than us three sitting here today. This is a movement, and this is about creating that pathway and paving that pathway for the next generation that will come through. But we just have to ensure that we're willing to have those conversations for them to be part of that. And that comes down to maturity. You know, if we're mature enough to have conversations with both a mix of generations, then that really creates a really good consensus and democratic society for all of us to be part of.
Building on from that discussion on young people voting, we just wanted to show you some vox pops about students speaking about whether they would vote or not, and just hear your comments about it after.
Yeah, awesome.
What issues do you think are most central to this upcoming election?
I mean, personally, I think like the renters' rights and like the tertiary education cuts as well.
Cost of living, like especially as a student, cost of living. I don't know, that's the only one I care about, to be honest.
Do you see the cost of living in New Zealand?
Tax policy is a big one for me.
I would say homelessness is a big one because that's a real issue at home.
And also the environment.
Environment?
The more aggressive climate policies that governments can be held accountable for.
Housing,
like in terms of flatting, renting, rent controls, things like that.
Personally, I'd say like climate policy. I don't know, education has just been a thing, I guess, that's kind of really circulated as needing to be improved.
Student loan, the threshold for student allowance, things like that. I'd say they're pretty big issues for students.
So, do you have any comments on that video?
Yeah, I think, you know, when you look at the critics that say young people can't be part of those political conversations, it's those young people right there that are showing they've got the maturity to have those conversations. Yeah. But also we're in a really challenging time right now for young people in New Zealand. We need to ensure that they are being heard, you know, and I think of things like climate change. That is our generation's big moment to actually have a say in how we're going to shape our future, because the time to act is now. We've been talking about that for years and years. So for me, it's about, again, ensuring that we've got elected representatives that represent people like yourself and I that share those common values. And if we want to ensure that we're addressing these issues that our young people are talking about, we need to be making sure that we're part of that process of electing them. Right now, this campaign and this election, again, is really daunting, and it's hard for young people to engage in. But if we want to ensure that we're future focused, that we're on the right track, and that we're heading towards a collective future for Aotearoa New Zealand, we need to ensure that we're being part of that and we're sharing our voice in that. The last thing I want to see is for young people like what we've just heard from continuing to face those challenges. If we want to address them, we need to be electing the right people.
And you've been a big advocate for Make It 16 and lowering the voting age. So what are your key reasons behind lowering the voting age?
Again, continuing those conversations that young people are absolutely prepared to have those tough conversations around our political system, but also democracy. You know, I think a lot of critics' perception of young people is perhaps an outdated perception. When you look at the challenges that we face right now as a country, whether it be the cost of living, whether it be mental health, or whether it be climate change, all those issues will be impacting our younger generations for a vastly longer time than any other generation. That's why it's so urgent for them to be part of those conversations. But when you look at why we should be lowering the age, the voting age to 16, it comes down to, at the age of 16, you can consent, you can get your driver's license, you can move out of home, you can leave school, you can even own a firearms license. Those are all very valid reasons to also have a say in our democratic systems. But also we pay income tax. I remember I had my first job at the age of 14 and I started paying income tax back then. In 2022 alone, 16 and 17-year-olds paid $92 million in income tax. They absolutely deserve to have a say in where that money is best spent.
Yes, the thing is though, is that, I mean, certainly when I was 16, I wasn't super clued in on politics. I knew some things, but I didn't know a lot. And I think a big issue that people have is, yes, 16-year-olds do have the right to consent, drive, pay tax, things like that. But the big question is, how do we push civic education in high schools? What would that look like in your mind?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's civics education across the entire community. You know, I know many 25-year-olds that probably aren't too sure on how to vote or who they're going to vote for. So I think that's an avenue that we really need to integrate into our education system, both for those still at school but in the wider community. Because again, if we want to be able to have these mature conversations about where our country is headed and who we're going to vote for, we need to ensure that the education is available for the wider community.
Yeah, and how do you think that we push for political literacy in our wider community and civic education without bias coming in for one side or another?
It starts with people like yourselves and I having these conversations, but again, that comes down to something that elected members also need to push for. It comes down to ensuring that we're having those safe spaces to have conversations that don't have that biased or extreme left or right views. Again, it comes down to these conversations and having a level of understanding that we're in a really changing and diverse society, but our young people need opportunities to engage in that.
And just wondering how you reconcile the Make It 16 and Labour Party's slight resistance to the movement, being a Labour candidate.
I think looking at our standpoint is, you know, there are many members of Parliament that align with the Labour Party that are supportive of lowering the voting age. That's why we've pushed towards lowering the voting age for local body elections. But first and foremost, we need to ensure that there is that civics education for the wider community on offer for those young people that do choose to vote. But I absolutely believe that young people are ready. They're ready to have their voice heard, and they absolutely deserve to have that say.
And how do you think that we can navigate talking about politics and improving political literacy with people who aren't necessarily that interested? For example, one of my flatmates told me she wasn't going to vote, and I said, yes, you are, and I will educate you. But how do you think that we can encourage these kind of conversations to occur with people who aren't necessarily that interested?
Yeah, and I think a lot of young people say, well, I'm not interested in politics. Why should I vote? I don't care about politics. And I used to have that same thought of mind when I was younger, but for me, I then soon realised politics is everything. If you care about, you know, how much you pay in rent, if you care about your renters' rights, if you care about the future and the way we're headed around our climate action, if you care about the state of our healthcare and mental well-being, that's politics. That's something we can all have a say in. And, you know, if not us, then who? And if not now, then when? And that's the quote I always go back to is, it is our opportunity to pave the path in the direction of our country. If we want to have a say in that, then we have to vote. You don't need to be fully aligned to one party or one candidate. You just have to have that general vibe between both of you and knowing that you have that common interest and that common understanding of what you both share and those values that you share between the party and the candidate. And that's the first stepping stone towards ensuring that we're all part of that and we're all heard in that society. But going back to the fact that we need representatives that represent people like yourselves and I, young people. I'm sure if your friend saw another young person putting their hand up in the ring to stand, then they'd probably be more inclined to ask them about why they're standing and what their motivations for standing is as well. So again, it's about ensuring that we have those people in those positions that are representative.
Yeah. And what do you think is the biggest issue that young people in New Zealand are facing at the moment?
Cost of living, but in a wider sense, climate change.
Yeah.
Yeah. And for me, it comes down to the fact that we need to be enabling those conversations as well. There is many politicians and many candidates that will continue to fob off a lot of the challenges that we face and that lie so clearly in front of us at the moment. But again, I'll go back to the point that it is these challenges and these issues that will affect our generation for the longest amount of time. We need to ensure that we're addressing that.
Yeah. And just briefly, before we wrap up our interview, is there anything you want to say to the Waitakians about why they should vote for you?
Oh, look, at the end of the day, it comes down to over the past 18 years, we have had the same representation, but we need to be asking ourselves, who's been advocating for Waitaki in Parliament? I'm really committed to being a strong, local and present voice, and I'd like to think that the past 6 months has proven that, but we take nothing for granted and we'll keep battling ahead over the next 4 weeks to continue representing the people of Waitaki, but also our young people so that they know they can have a say in politics and they can shape the future of Aotearoa.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Ethan. It's been so refreshing to hear your views on youth and young people in New Zealand at the moment. And thank you to our dedicated production team and of course our viewers. Thank you.
Well, kia ora koutou katoa and welcome back to Vote 2023. I'm Jonah Broughton, this is my co-host Sophie Boma, and today we have the privilege of being joined by James Christmas. James is a practicing public and treaty lawyer and has been selected to run as a list-only candidate for National in the 2023 general election. James has previous experience as assistant to the Attorney General Chris Finlayson and to Prime Ministers John Key and Bill English.
James, thank you for joining us. We'd like to start with some quick-fire questions. Can you describe the National Party in 3 words?
I think the 3 words I'd use to describe the National Party are ambitious, aspirational, and outward-looking, and that has a hyphen, so it's 1 word.
And do you think personality or policy will decide the outcome of this year's election?
I hope that policy does. I think we've had enough personality politics in New Zealand in the last few years. I want to see a really relentless focus on the issues and a good policy debate, and I think we're actually having that this election, which I think is encouraging.
In 30 seconds, can you explain what an Attorney General does?
Well, the Attorney General it's quite an old position. We've inherited it as part of our common law tradition from England, and I say England, not the United Kingdom, because in the United Kingdom it's the Attorney General for England and Wales. Basically, the role is to be head of the legal profession, and it's to ensure that the rule of law is upheld and complied with by the government. So the Attorney General sits in Cabinet, makes sure colleagues are following the law, but more broadly than that, the government and the Crown is operating in accordance with the rule of law.
Right, now onto the meat and bones. I'd like to ask you, can you tell us a little bit about your role as advisor to Prime Minister John Key and what that role entailed, how you found it?
Yeah, so I think in our system, every minister gets to appoint a press secretary and an advisor, and Prime Ministers are the same, but Prime Ministers tend to have a few more, given Prime Ministers usually get whatever they want. So I worked as what's called a ministerial advisor for Chris Finlayson, and I did that for a few years, and John Key then asked me to go up to his office. Really, you have a whole lot of portfolios which you look after for the Prime Minister. So if, in my case, if he was looking at a legal issue or something to do with national security, I'd be the person in the room with him. John actually resigned 6 weeks after I joined his office, which he later blamed on me at his leaving dinner, but then I stayed on with Bill English. So I was actually with Bill more than I was with John, but you're meant to sort of be there as a right-hand man or woman or person or whatever to make sure the Prime Minister has what they need.
Yeah, so given that experience with the National Security and Intelligence portfolio, briefly, what do you think are the biggest issues facing New Zealand around national security and intelligence?
So I think one of the great things in recent years is that our intelligence agencies, the SIS and the GCSB, which used to be in the shadows, as you'd expect, have really come out more into the open. They've reassessed what they can actually say in public. So you are seeing a lot more discussion about some of the domestic and international threats that we face, and we do face threats domestically, as we've unfortunately seen in the last few years, but we also face a range of international challenges. So we have to be very alive to things that we might have used to have thought were just in the movies, such as espionage, such as this disinformation from foreign powers. These are things we have to keep a careful eye on. I think our agencies do a really good job in doing so, but it's something we really have to have our eye on the ball at all times.
Well, you touched on disinformation there, and I think given that we're in election year now, that's a particular concern people have. Do you think there's been an increase in disinformation in past years, and do you think that is a concern this election?
I think there's a danger with some of these words that they can come to mean a number of things to different people. I mean, in a political campaign, you're going to see a range of views expressed. You're going to see a range of political arguments. You're going to see some people may not have quite as firm a grasp on the facts as others. We've seen that with some of the election advertising coming out from some parties, not National, I should say. But I think more broadly on the question of disinformation, we've seen issues in the United States. We saw issues that came out of COVID, and really that whole question about how do you know if what you're looking at is accurate or not. And I've been thinking recently about AI, especially with AI image generation. Are we already at the point where it's impossible to tell if an image is real or not? We might not be far off it. How government actually responds to that, or how we deal with that, is a really, really difficult policy question, and there's no easy answer for it, but that's probably something we're going to have to look at in the next 10 years, because it's just going to land on our desks.
Well, in light of disinformation, what are your thoughts on the recently passed legislation to lower the voting age to 16 for local elections?
So as far as I understand, that was introduced into the House in the last week, so it got its first reading. I mean, my party's position is that we support leaving the voting age where it is. I think we have to be quite careful with legislation around that. I was quite surprised it was introduced in the last week and went through its first reading in the last week of a sitting block. It is quite a big change, and I think if we're going to progress those sorts of changes, they need to be done in quite a well-signalled way that brings as many people along with you as possible, and I don't think that happened in that situation.
Well, speaking of young people voting in this election, let's see what they have to say about the issues they're facing.
Are y'all planning on voting this year?
Yeah, guess so.
Definitely.
Yes. Yes.
Definitely.
Yes. I am.
Yeah, I am. Yep.
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 Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yep.
That's the plan, yeah?
Yes.
Yes, I am. Saying.
Yes, probably.
Maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
I'm not planning on voting this year.
I am not. Probably not. I just don't know anything about it, really.
I don't know, I just haven't done enough research on it, so.
Because I don't know enough about it. I haven't read enough. I haven't learned enough about policies and anything to really feel like I can vote.
Oh, it's pretty important. It's quite bad, I think, if you don't vote. I mean, and then complain afterwards of like not getting stuff. So yeah.
I think it's part of our civil role.
I think it's important, do your civil duty, democracy, all that, because it's important.
Well, it's pretty important to like have a voice as like a citizen, you know.
I think it's important to have my say, especially because it affects me.
Well, I suppose it's important that everyone does. Because it's good to have a say, an opinion, and it actually impacts me with uni budget cuts and all that.
I think it's just really important to have a good understanding of everything that's going on in the country. Yeah, I guess make sure your voice is heard.
I kind of want to see some change. Would like for it to be not terrifying every time I go to the supermarket.
Hoping to help make a bit of change in the country.
Because I care about issues such as like wealth inequality in New Zealand, and it's something I'm really big on, so I want to use my vote, hopefully.
Exercise my right to vote and, help make decisions about the country.
Because I feel like it's the right thing to do.
I guess you can't complain if you don't.
Act scurvy.
So James, what was your main takeaway from watching that?
My main takeaway from that is there does seem to be quite a strong sense of civic duty among all of those people. The one comment that did concern me was the one, I'm not going to vote because I might not know enough to be able to do it. Really, everyone should know that they can and should vote. We don't have a situation in New Zealand like we do in Australia where it's compulsory, where you're actually forcing people to the ballot booth, ballot box. I think that's probably right, a good thing. Don't think people should feel strong-armed into doing it. I guess you could construct an argument why you shouldn't vote. I personally wouldn't do that. All those people should go and vote. There's a lot of stuff online now, so you can compare different parties' policies. All of our policies are online. There's a lot of material on social media. I think you should have a look and go and vote. If you can't work out who to vote for, work out who best fits your views and just go and tick that box. And hopefully that box is national.
How do you gauge the interest of students in voting compared to when you first started in politics?
Well, I mean, this is my first campaign, but I started working in politics 2008 or so. I haven't noticed any massive change. I mean, I think social media has probably increased interest to an extent. Sometimes you hear from people, though, they still feel the whole system is a bit foreign, so they're looking at videos of politicians or issues online, but just in terms of how the whole thing fits together is missing. But, I think it's quite... I think you've probably got a more engaged audience now just because of the different range of media. When I was at university, I'm now the old age of 37, we still had flip phones, so you couldn't access material. I mean, we had MySpace, and there wasn't much stuff on there. So I think there's probably more engagement, but maybe the underlying issue there's that structural knowledge.
And do you think that those issues that those people are talking about, including the cost of living crisis, climate change and so forth, do you think the increasing urgency of those issues is driving young people to be more politically engaged? Do you view this as a positive?
Yeah, I view it as a positive. It's an unfortunate set of circumstances, almost desperation in some senses, that is driving people there. We've seen a few public polls now that have actually had a bit of a demographic breakdown, and we're seeing actually quite strong support for National in the 18 to 24s and the 24s to 30s. And I think that reflects the real feeling out there of desperation in terms of just, someone mentioned before, going to the supermarket. These are quite worrying things, and people are looking for answers, and we're hoping to provide them.
Okay. Well, I'm going to move on to talking about an area of expertise that you have in, which is, of course, the treaty and the work you've done with Chris Finlayson. You two co-authored a book, He Kupu Taurangi, about the history of treaty settlements under the national government. And specifically the issue of co-governance, which you two discuss in the book and has become quite a hot topic this election. I just want to ask, can you give our audience a quick explainer on what co-governance is?
Yeah, well, that's the million-dollar question. So if you'd asked me that in 2017, I would have said co-governance is about involving Māori, involving iwi, in the management of specific natural resources. So, for example, and we've seen them through a number of treaty settlements. So, for example, we see the Waikato River settlement that brought the iwi along the river in with local government and Crown appointees to manage it together. And in doing so, it helped put an end to what had been a really long-running treaty claim going back to the 19th century. Those arrangements are replicated in other areas, 90 Mile Beach, the Auckland Maunga or volcanoes. They were really on a specific set of circumstances like that. What we've seen over the last 6 years is a slight change in the use of the word co-governance, and I don't think it's been a useful one. So you've seen it used to justify things such as the Māori Health Authority, which the National Party opposes. You've seen it as a word that's expanded to mean all sorts of other things, and I think the problem with that is the lack of definition now has been quite scary for some people, and it's really moved a long way away from what it originally was, which was the co-management of the environment.
So what would that look like under a national government?
The co-governance in general? Well, I think you see this, I mean, we negotiated the vast majority of co-governance agreements in New Zealand. In the book that you mentioned, we were quite open that we probably got the word wrong. We probably should have stuck to co-management, or I don't know, something boring like environmental management partnerships or something. I think the problem with the word co-governance is it was just a bit too close to co-government. And that's probably where it's morphed in some people's heads. It hasn't been helped by the lack of definition under the current government.
And how would you, I'm just going back to my previous question, if you could give us like a soundbite definition of what your view of co-governance is.
So I suppose the soundbite version would be to say, at least in a 2017 respect, and what we would believe now, is that it's about the Crown and local government working alongside iwi to manage environmental features in a way that recognises the Treaty of Waitangi.
And do you think that co-governance comes as part of that treaty settlement process? Do you think perhaps we could look at the original document and, for example, Article 2 of the treaty gives tino rangatiratanga to Māori? Do you think that can be used as a basis for co-governance?
So it certainly has proceeded through settlements. It doesn't necessarily have to. There is provision within the Local Government Act for what you could call co-governance agreements, whether you're putting iwi representation onto committees or whatever. Yes, the Article 2 guarantee of tino rangatiratanga is applicable to environment. That has mostly been managed through treaty settlements, but you see it in other pieces of legislation too. For example, you see it in the reference to treaty principles in the RMA and the Conservation Act and all those sorts of things. But we would see the individual agreements as mostly coming through settlements. Actually, they've completely come through treaty settlements so far.
Right. So the polls are looking like National will need ACT to form a government in this coming election. That's what the polling pretty much consistently has been looking like. And ACT is firmly against co-governance. Their party manifesto, all their policies point that way. Given your expertise, how do you feel about governing with ACT, given that stance?
Well, I mean, the first thing I'd say is I can only really speak for my own party, right? I can't speak on behalf of ACT, but I suppose looking at the ACT party, I'd say we share some values. One of the values that we share is an absolute belief in property rights. And I've always thought that's why the National Party has been generally more successful at negotiating treaty settlements, is because we really have a view of the world grounded in property rights and in the restoration of property rights. My view has always been that that is probably more consistent with a worldview based on tino rangatiratanga than the opposite approach. I think the Labour Party has tended to look at treaty settlements through a social justice lens, which I guess you can do, but I don't think it's as useful. So I suppose the ACT Party has generally supported all treaty settlement legislation with a couple of exemptions, I think. I think there's common ground there. When you look at our shared values, I don't see that ACT wouldn't support treaty settlements, for example, anymore. They've supported treaty settlements with co-governance agreements in them before under the former definition.
So you have a shared opposition to the definition being used by the Labour Party?
I don't know if you'd call it an opposition because I think it's too hard to work out what it is. I mean, we can say what we oppose, which is we oppose the idea that you have to extend two systems into the public services, for example. We don't see there's a treaty reason to have these big bureaucracies like the Māori Health Authority. We would rather work directly with iwi, which is the Crown's role. We don't think you need an office with 400 staff in Wellington to do it. So I think there's definitely synergies there.
So if National and ACT form a coalition, how will you reconcile your work with treaty settlements to ACT's opposition to co-governance?
Well, I mean, I think it's probably in what I've said, in that I think, you know, if we have treaty settlement agreements which have co-management or whatever we call them agreements in there, ACT has supported those in the past. I think what we are opposing is the idea that this has to be extended into every realm of public life. I actually think the Crown has greater duties in terms of working with iwi in partnership than just setting up these separate authorities and saying the problem's solved. I mean, the Māori Health Authority is a disaster zone. It's shown us that isn't actually the case.
Well, just moving on just beyond co-governance, ACT also has other policies related to the treaty. For example, they want to pass the Treaty of Waitangi Act, which will strictly define the principles, the treaty principles, and this will be passed by a referendum. What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, I don't think my party has an official policy on that yet, right? So that's something that would have to be discussed, presumably, and I am a list candidate at number 28, so it's very dangerous for me to get too far ahead of myself. Could be a very fast end to my career. But I would say I see, I mean, there are challenges in that approach. I think treaty principles have been with us for quite a while now, since the late 1980s. They were never defined by Parliament, and that's what has left the courts to define what they are. So I suppose all I can say on that is I think what ACT is proposing would be a significant change in the way things are done.
Do you think that change will be a source of tension during coalition debates, for example?
I honestly couldn't comment on that bit.
No comment? Okay, fair enough.
So how would you reconcile National's tough on crime approach with the value of New Zealand Bora and the role of upholding it as the Attorney General?
Well, I think the rights which are listed in the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act are extremely important. I mean, most of them are freedoms. We're looking at the ability to be able to do things. Whenever you pass legislation which has an impact on people's liberties, and that includes sentencing or, you know, cracking down on crime or whatever you want to call it, it will occasionally raise those issues. They have to be considered carefully, and one of the important roles of the Attorney General is to do what's called a Section 7 report if legislation goes through the House, and that is a strict piece of legal analysis. It is not political. It's why Attorneys General can occasionally be unpopular with their colleagues, but that is part of the role. Those reports, I think the current Attorney General has been assiduous in doing them, as his predecessors have been too, and they point out for Parliament what the inconsistencies are with the Bill of Rights Act if they can't be justified, and of course we now have the courts that will look at those things too. We've had declarations. I think all those things together at least allow the public to know what the legal situation is and what the balance is, because it is always a balance. Sometimes it may be the right thing for Parliament to do, even if it isn't justified by the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act, and that's illustrated in the example people overseas find quite funny, which our Attorney General will deliver a report saying something contravenes the Bill of Rights Act and then go and vote for it.
And so do you think that National's policies on crime will contradict the Bill of Rights Act in some circumstances?
Not necessarily. I mean, often it depends on the way that you do it. There was an example recently with the ram raiding legislation, which the Labour government put through in quite a rush, and the Attorney General had to do a Section 7 report on that. I think there were 3 different sections. My view was that some of that could have been resolved if they'd actually taken their time to work out how they were doing it.
What about, for example, the policy on banning gang patches? What about the freedom of expression, which is guaranteed in the Bill of Rights? Is that a source of tension?
That's definitely, I mean, anything like that is always a source of tension with the Bill of Rights Act, and it requires quite a strict legal analysis to work out where the rights sit, you know, whether it's justified. But I mean, it depends on the piece of legislation and how it's done. But I mean, those issues definitely arise. Freedom of expression is a very common article or section of the Bill of Rights that's raised in Section 7 reports.
Well, on banning gang patches, what's to stop somebody from just picking up a tattoo gun and putting their gang affiliation on their body in a permanent and more like committed way?
Yeah, well, I suppose they could. I mean, it depends what legislation looks like.
And that's not more harmful?
Well, I mean, those are the sorts of challenges that any government or any parliament faces in passing these sorts of bills, and it's one of the reasons that the select committee process is really important, because you actually hear from people who can say, you know, not necessarily even using that example, but what's proposed here will have these practical implications, and often you see select committees making changes as a result. But I think whatever sort of legislation is passed on anything, it has to be practical and it has to work and it has to balance those rights.
Just continuing on this issue of the gang policy, do you think that your party's policy of all of those things which will increase gang member incarceration is just putting all these gang members in prison the best way to deal with it? Because surely they'll get out of prison in a few more years, and if they'll just reoffend and get put back in prison, that's not actually dealing with the root cause of why there's gangs and why these people join gangs.
Yeah, well, there's a philosophical and a political and a philosophical discussion you can have about that. My former boss, Bill English, is quite famous now for saying that prisons are I think his words are a moral failure in society, and I think we'd all agree with that, but we have to look practically as well, that there has been significant increases in crime across the board. I'm a list candidate, so I'm able to get out with my colleagues door knocking, and I've been doing that all around Auckland. It's amazing how many houses you walk down the driveway of that have multiple security cameras, alarms, deadbolts on sliding doors. The fact is that people out there are facing an increase in crime and people are feeling unsafe in some situations, so that has to be addressed somehow. And if you're actually dealing with people's lives and people being burgled, people being harassed, sure, we can work towards a system one day where what Bill English said is right, but at the moment we actually have to take practical measures, and that's going to mean being tougher.
So to finish up in 30 seconds, why should a student vote for National?
I guess my view of the National Party is that we've been around for coming up 100 years now, and we have been successful in my view because we've combined two different political traditions in New Zealand. We brought together what was called the Liberal tradition, really strong down in Dunedin and Southland, and a more conservative political tradition. We've brought them together into something which is actually quite a special combination of traditions, and it's enabled National to actually have an eye on the past but an eye on the future, and it's enabled us to do really great things like treaty settlements. It's enabled us to run economies well. It's enabled us to look at society as a whole, look at where support's required. It's enabled us to move in a pragmatic rather than an ideological way. I think we have a lot to offer young people. We really, really want to get our economy back on track. We want to make this an attractive place to live. I don't want any more of my friends or your friends moving overseas to work. I want them coming back here knowing they can build a successful life here. That's what we're all about.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, James, and thank you, of course, to our dedicated production team and, of course, our viewers. We'll be back next week with more thought-provoking discussion. Until then, stay informed, stay engaged, and we'll see you next time.